As Anya says, you know, there's something here about kind of talking about holiday hunger, but I guess I kind of want to take a step back and talk about poverty, what our current situation is, how that links to education, and therefore some of those challenges that we have around holiday hunger. So hopefully I've got 15 minutes, Anya's allowed me. So I'm afraid I may bombard you with information, but I hope that that's useful, and please do, you know, have an opportunity for questions at the end. So let me just kind of reiterate what Anya talked about. So first of all, my name's Luke Bramhall. I am the Poverty Proofing and Participation Service Manager for Children North East. Children North East, for those that don't know, as Anya mentioned, it's 130th year this year. So back in 1891, we were founded as the Poor Children's Holiday Association by two philanthropists who were living in Gosforth, who wanted to work with the street children who were living in the slums on the banks of the River Tyne, what we now know as the Quayside, and took the children down to Tynemouth to have holidays and days out. So that's kind of where we began, and I guess I start there because there's something about that journey of Children North East that's really kind of prevalent to today, that you know, the challenges we're facing around poverty. So that's who I am and where I'm from. Just in terms of the next kind of 15 minutes, what I want to do is just talk, you know, very kind of quickly almost about the context, you know, poverty, what is it, where are we at right now? I also, and then how that impacts in terms of kind of within education and within that kind of holiday period, and just what we know. I'm then going to just talk very kind of briefly about some of Children North East's response to that and how we're approaching and addressing that, because obviously it's at the heart of what we want to be doing as a regional charity. So without further ado, I will kind of go for it. So first of all, what do we mean by poverty? It's really important. We use the term poverty and it's a loaded term, and people have kind of preconceived ideas around what we mean by it. There are all sorts of definitions around poverty. Obviously, we get our statistics from this government definition, which is that you're in poverty if your household income is less than 60% of the median income. Or also termed as kind of relative poverty. Just to be clear about what I mean by poverty, you know, in school, sorry, we use terms like pupil premium and free school meals, and I'll come on to them. But when I use the term poverty, I use this kind of, and not just me, as a charity, and other charities like Child Poverty Action Group and Joseph Rowntree Foundation, that if you lack the resources to have the types of diet, participate in the activities, have the living conditions that's kind of deemed normal, if you can't afford to do what's expected within your society to be able to kind of you know, take part, belong, be part of, then you're considered to be living in poverty. And I guess there's something about that doesn't mean that there's a hard and fast line where inevitably we end up with winners and losers, if you like, in terms of that poverty term. So that's what I mean by poverty. But if we stuck with that kind of that government definition, that relative poverty, which we use in terms of poverty levels right now, and bearing in mind, when I say right now, these are pre-COVID figures. The figures are about 18 months. There's about an 18-month lag. So we're talking 14 million people are living in poverty in our country. 4.3 million children are living in poverty. And I say that a lot and I always feel like I need to kind of check myself on it. 4.3 million children day by day are suffering the effects of poverty. This is a humongous issue. And what's even worse, the Institute for Fiscal Studies predicts that in about kind of 3 years, by the time we get to those statistics, we're talking 5.2 million children are going to be living in poverty. The projection, and bearing in mind this is the projection pre-COVID, that no matter how poverty is affecting our lives, our communities, our schools now, that figure is going to increase. That is likely to increase, you know, in terms of, you know, if you think of a classroom, no matter how much poverty is impacting children in that classroom, the likelihood is that over the coming years, we're going to see that increase and multiply. So poverty is you know, or child poverty particularly, is a massive issue nationally. Now I know that you might have to kind of squint your eyes to have a proper look at this, but there's something about, well, what does that kind of mean in the Northeast? This is recent data that's come out around the previous 5 years by the End Child Poverty Coalition. And what it basically shows, so this isn't just looking at the Northeast, this is a table of the top local authorities that have seen the biggest increases in child poverty over the last 5 years, or certainly between 2014 and 2020. Okay, and what you'll very quickly see is that the top 12 local authorities in terms of increases of child poverty are the 12 local authorities that make up the Northeast. You know, we're talking significant impact here right now in the Northeast. I mean, it's absolutely shocking if you think that the highest outside of the Northeast is 8%, yet in Newcastle we're seeing nearly a 13% increase in child poverty over 5 years. You know, massive issues and challenges. And just to kind of build on that, we know a bit more. So 42% of families with at least one child under the age of 5 in the Northeast live in poverty. We're the free school meal capital of the country. We took over from London about 3 years ago. And we also know that 1 in 4 children in the Northeast are living in poverty but aren't eligible for free school meals, which is a really interesting consideration when we start thinking about holiday hunger, because we know that we've got this half funding holiday activities fund that's come through from the DFE, but it's for those eligible for free school meals, not those living or suffering the effects of poverty. And just, isn't it fascinating that pre-COVID, 71% of children lived in households where there were little or no savings in the Northeast. And again, consistent high rates of unemployment. Now, these are all big figures, and I just want to start kind of very quickly, just touch on, that's all very well, but we're a children's charity, and we look at these figures and these big figures, and we can say these are abhorrent, these are horrendous. But there's something about, for me, we really need to kind of really understand, well, what does that mean? What is that like for a child? We need to put ourselves in the shoes of that child living in poverty to best be able to respond and understand what the realities of that poverty are. What we know about some of those stark consequences are that there is significant impact on health. We know that you're much more likely to be in and out of hospital before the age of 5. You're much more likely to suffer with asthma, with diabetes. You're much more likely to suffer with tooth decay, obesity. And if we kind of go the full journey, we're talking about real kind of life expectancy. We know statistically that your life expectancy can be up to 20 years less if you live in in an area with high levels of poverty. There was a statistic that came out that if you lived in the central ward in Stockton and you're a male, then your life expectancy was on par with a male living in Ethiopia. Poverty is having such a massive impact within our country. So when we start talking about education and schools, we can see that there are significant impacts. We understand the health inequalities because of poor housing, overcrowding, housing that's deemed unfit to live in. We see it because of the food insecurity that many families are facing. We know that there's millions of people going a day a week without eating anything because they can't afford it. I think 4.9 million was the last figure I had on that. We're talking significant statistics, but let's put ourselves, what's that like for that child living in poverty? What's that kind of lens? And I think it's really important that we explore that. And I'm going to come back to that and return to that kind of slightly as we just begin to unpick kind of some of our response as a charity to these challenges. And on top of that, we've hit COVID, and you may have seen this graphic before. We've all been through these choppy waters, but we've all got different boats to make our way through it in. And what's been fascinating is that 3 in 10 families have reported that COVID has had a negative impact on their financial kind of security or status. Actually, 2 in 10 families have found it's been better for they're in a better financial position. What we're seeing is these kind of inequalities extending ultimately, and that's the impact of COVID. So as we come round to our second summer holiday, actually the numbers and the levels of children that are in that position of, frankly, really struggling, it's just increasing. And so we find families trapped, and this is a graphic from Joseph Rowntree Foundation following some of their work. We know and will recognise some of these challenges that families are that are trapping families into poverty and families feeling really kind of stuck. And I guess there's something within that, and within some of these kind of statistics here, which I'll not go through, that point towards the fact that poverty is a structural issue. You know, we know statistically that poverty is a consequence of the structures and inequalities in society. We're suffering for that, particularly up here in the Northeast. But what that does is it gives us a framework, a template by within which we as a charity feel as though we can respond to these high levels of poverty, respond to the provision that we offer, and support schools and during holiday times. So I'm not going to kind of dwell on this, because I'm sure many people in the room know some of this, but we know that household income is the biggest predictor of educational attainment. We know that children are starting school up to 11 months behind their better off peers. We know that the gap is growing, and we see that in attainment. And this attainment gap that we see within our schools. There's a really interesting, factor within this that families that are kind of suffering from persistent disadvantage, that attainment gap is broader, and I touch on those things because I guess there's more to it in terms of within education. We know about the attainment gap, but there's something here about poverty and shame, and I'm just going to kind of touch on that as I briefly kind of mention poverty proofing and our response as a charity to this. And then this idea of cost, the fact that there is a cost to school and families are really struggling with that. But what's really fascinating is that there's a cost to school. We see it in some of the evidence that's come out. There's been evidence from various different places. Children's Society have talked about uniforms as of nationwide. We found out, some of the challenges around the digital divide and such like during COVID. So some real challenges there. And there's if it's time, talk about some of that research that we found. But that's in school. And I think that what I'm presenting is that there's real challenges within school for families that are living in poverty when we talk about cost and shame. But actually, there's sometimes even bigger challenges when schools break, and this notion of holiday hunger. And there's some of the statistics, some of the facts that we know. Feeding Britain have recently released a report that estimated that 3 million children are at risk of hunger. 1 million who are in receipt of free school meals. This is nationally, but an estimated 2 million who live in poverty but don't meet that threshold to that entitlement. And that kind of refers back to that some of those figures that I was talking about earlier, the number of children that are living in poverty that don't have that eligibility for free school meals. The calculation that's been made is that the additional cost to families in terms of during holiday time is £30 to £40 a week. Now you imagine, you're in a situation where your household income is really tight, and then suddenly we're in this position where those free school meal the free school meals are stopped, and suddenly you're in this really kind of pressure point. If I just build on that, what's really fascinating is that pressure point, that £30 to £40 a week, is over the summer. Now, what happens in September is that we have, pressure, not always from the schools, but peer pressure that parents feel around, and we've heard this in consultation, to buy that new uniform. So in September, you've got all the things that you need, the stationery that you might need. This is, it's deemed that September is one of the most expensive. One study suggested it is the most expensive time of a family's year, more expensive than Christmas because of the pressure on uniform and those kind of things. So I think there's something really interesting about this real pressure point that is the holidays for children and families. So I've kind of talked a lot about context and conscious of time, and time is ticking, Anya. So very conscious of that. But I've talked about kind of the context within which we are living in, some of the challenges that families are facing. And I guess it's quite bleak. That's the fact of the matter. It is quite bleak. But I just kind of talk about this because, I'm an optimist and a bit of an idealist, and I just want to kind of present something really positive, what we've talked about is that, you know, we recognize the structural inequalities that result in poverty and that increasing levels of poverty. But because it's a structural issue, what that means is there's something we can do about it. And there's a challenge here. You know, what can we do within the structures of our society to eliminate the inequalities that children are facing? And there's maybe some big kind of questions and societal wide governmental kind of discussions to be had. But there's something about how can we work within our schools, for example, to you know, within the structures, the policies, the practices of our school day to eliminate those inequalities. How, as charities like ourselves, can we work within our the processes, the policies to ensure that whatever we provide over the summer, over the holidays, is accessible to everybody, no matter how much money they've got. And I think that there's a really interesting question around this that I guess I kind of pose and want to challenge. Because time's ticked, I don't want to go too much into kind of the work that we've done as a response, because I'm conscious of time and we want to hear from some other speakers. But I guess there's something here about, you know, poverty is having a significant impact in our society. There's things such as the HAF funding, which is trying to deal with, you know, feeding children right now. That's great. But ultimately, if we're really going to deal with holiday hunger, we need to kind of be addressing that issue of poverty. And I think that is ultimately the situation that we're in. And I guess that, you know, that for me would be my kind of, you know, my challenge or kind of question. How can we ensure that the children that we work with within the structures of our school days, within the structures of our holiday support, can be accessible to everybody who's living in poverty? So I hope that I've not rambled on and waffled on too much there, Anya. But as I say, you know, would really welcome the opportunity to come and talk a bit more about kind of some of our response to that. But hopefully that's given.
Luke, that was great. And we're going to hear from the other two speakers, and then we'll be coming back for questions. So maybe some of the things that you want to bring in, we can bring in then, if that's all right. Yeah. But I was quite taken, just very quickly. Did you actually say that if you were a male living in poverty in the northeast, then your well-being is on a par with someone in Ethiopia?
So it's the life expectancy. So specifically, so if you live in the Stockton, I think it's called Stockton Town Centre or a Central Ward, then you're a male, then your life expectancy is on par with that of a male living in Ethiopia.
Crikey.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next speaker is Merike Williams. Welcome. You are an educator, an activist, trade unionist, and you are chair of the Northern Region Council. Welcome, and talk to us about the impact of poverty on attainment in education, please. Over to you.
Thank you, Anya. Just before I do start, I live about 5 minutes car journey away from central Stockton. And that statistic that we've just heard from Luke has absolutely shocked me to the core. And it goes so far to show why this campaign is so important. So as Anya said, my name is Merike Williams. I am an early years teacher and I'm a member of the National Education Union, and I'm currently the chair of the Northern Region NEU. Right, let's pull up some notes. Sorry. Okay, so we've talked a lot about poverty already today, and you're considered to be below the poverty line if you live in a household with less than 60% of the national median income. But in more human terms, if you're poor, you're unable to live at the same standard that most other people would expect. We've heard today that 4.3 million children live in poverty in the UK. To put that in an educational perspective, that equals 9 out of 30 pupils in a class living in poverty. Poverty is the strongest statistical predictor of how well a child will achieve at school. Only 26.6% of children eligible for free school meals receive 5 good GCSEs. Now, as an early years teacher, I had to ask one of my secondary colleagues what that actually equates to, because I still worked in old money of A star to C. But I am told that that's now a grade 4 to 9, but 5 is actually a good GCSE pass. So yes, 26.6% of children are eligible for free school meals. Who are eligible for free school meals receive 5 good GCSEs, compared with 54.2% of children who are not on free school meals or not eligible. In general, students living in poverty are 4 times more likely to be excluded from school than their peers. Even with the same qualifications, disadvantaged students are more than 50% more likely to be classed as NEET, not in education, employment or training. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, 1 in 4 lone parents live in persistent poverty. And that persistent poverty is defined as when a household experiences relatively low income, both in the current year and in at least 2 out of the 3 preceding years. Children in low persistent poverty are behind by 11.3 months compared to their secondary school peers. Children in high persistent poverty are behind by 22.7 months. On average, that's a disadvantage gap of 18.1 months, a year and a half behind. Other factors affecting education that are linked to poverty is that poverty, as we've heard from Luke, is strongly linked to health inequalities. Respiratory problems such as asthma and bronchitis are more common in children growing up in poverty and can negatively impact attendance on school. 23% of parents with children under 18 reported skipping meals in order to feed their children. The parents are doing the best they can with the choices that they have. There's a strong stigma attached to poverty, and children living in poverty are often bullied at school. A lot of children who are entitled to free school meals don't actually take them, and poorer families will often go without other items to protect their children from this stigma and from being bullied. And poverty affects children's ability to make and keep friends. It affects their friendships at school, with children growing up in poverty more likely to play alone and fall out with their friends, and less likely to talk to their friends about their worries. 34% of children in families where someone's disabled are in poverty, compared to 28% of children in families where no one identifies as disabled. Often, the disabled people are deprived of the opportunity to participate in productive work, and thus they can become impoverished more easily than the rest of the population. Poverty also causes new disabilities as a result of poor and dangerous living and work conditions. 46% of children from Black and ethnic minority groups are living in poverty. Refugees and migrants are more likely to be living in poverty, with no access to public funds, insecure housing, a lack of knowledge of the education system, language barriers, and children caring for their adult relatives. Impacts on poverty and inclusion and achievements at school. And this is all awful, I'm sure you agree. But why were the NEU involved in a campaign around this? So, a colleague of mine from the Northern region is an art teacher. She's fantastic. She's taught her pupils how to mix flour and water in order to make glue, how to mix flour and food colouring to make paint. When our school communities are struggling to put food on the table, she recognised that they cannot go out and afford to buy the resources that were needed for schoolwork. Over the last year and a half, we've been placed in an unprecedented situation. We've had to suddenly, overnight, recreate our entire curriculum, our entire schemes of work, as schools were ordered to close. I'm sure you'll all agree they didn't close. Most of our education staff have been in school every single day, working through their holidays in some cases. However, according to the mainstream media, we closed. And some children were indeed working from home, and home learning had to be provided. But when your subject is art, and you rely on resources, those resources need to be bought and paid for. And if you can't afford food, you're not going to be able to go out and buy art resources. So my colleague was absolutely amazing in giving them ideas on how to create their own. Many families have been placed in that position over the last year and a half due to lockdowns and isolation periods. I'm actually self-isolating at the moment due to my bubble popping at school the other week. So I'm based in the south of the Northern region. I'm in Stockton-on-Tees. And I have some statistics for Stockton of it was a 7.7 percentage, that's difficult to say at this time on a Saturday afternoon, increase in levels of poverty over the last couple of years. It's scary. It's incredibly scary. I've been doing some campaigning in my neighbouring town of Hartlepool recently because there was a by-election. I don't know if you picked up on that. There were 16 candidates in that by-election, and so we had a few Hartlepool specific statistics to share. 37% of children in Hartlepool are living in poverty, and that's 11 children in every classroom. The number of children in Hartlepool who are eligible for free school meals has increased from 29% in 2018 to 34% in 2020, and this will have undoubtedly become worse during the COVID pandemic. The figures, I believe, that the government have used in order to determine who's eligible for free school meals from their census did not take into account the families that have been placed into poverty during the pandemic because of furlough and job closures. Children living in poverty have been let down by the government and ministers who have repeatedly refused to provide families living in poverty the support that they need. The NEU recognised this and decided to do something about it and put the money where the mouth is. And so at the start of 2021, we launched the Help a Child to Learn campaign. The NEU pledged £1 million to schools serving the most disadvantaged children, and we partnered with the Daily Mirror, with their readers, to help us raise even more. Our regions and districts chipped in. Northern Region NEU donated £35,000 to the campaign, and together with my colleagues from across the region, we coordinated a local campaign, because we recognised that whilst the national campaign was excellent and was much needed, as it was based on the number of children receiving free school meals, we knew not all children living below the poverty line would get the help that they needed. And so my amazing union colleagues from around the region put together resource packs. They sourced them, they put them together themselves. We reached out to food banks, we reached out to local charitable organisations and arranged for packs to be distributed to those most in need. Across the UK, well over 1,000 schools responded and accepted and have received their vouchers. Members, communities and businesses all came together, and we continue to call on the government to fully fund early years, schools and colleges. Now, although this campaign has had a positive impact for local families, it is a sticking plaster over a much larger issue that needs urgent government attention and intervention. Something I've been asked a few times by friends and family who don't work in education is, oh, that's nice, Pet, but it's not your job to feed them, is it? But it is. It is our job. It's our job as educators. It's why we do this job, giving our pupils the best chance in life. It's our job as trade union members, because social justice is arguably the founding principle of the trade union movement. It's our job as human beings to remove the stigma of poverty and not to other groups to which we do not belong. We're all human. This could happen to any one of us. And if you look at the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, there are two quotes which link nicely with this. Article 27, around the adequate standard of living, says every child has the right to a standard of living that's good enough to meet their physical and social needs and support their development. And governments must help families who cannot afford to provide this. Article 29, Goals of Education, say that education must develop every child's personality, talents and abilities to the full. It must encourage the child's respect for human rights, as well as respect for their parents, their own and other cultures, and the environment. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that certain parts of those articles from the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child are not being met by our government at this certain moment in time. Children cannot learn and reach their full potential on an empty stomach. I mean, have you ever tried to do a weekly shop when you're hungry? It doesn't go well. The only things that end up in the trolley, if I go to Tesco when I'm hungry, are the things that I want to have for tea that night. because no thought is given to the rest of the week or the other things in your house that you may need, because the only thing you can think about is being hungry. Now imagine living in poverty and not being able to do that weekly food shop. Imagine being a child in poverty, being expected to conform to school rules and regulations, listen and pay attention and learn whatever it is that's being taught to help you pass the next test the government expects you to sit. Imagine the only hot meal you get each day is at school. How would you feel coming up to the school holidays, knowing you won't eat for a week or more? Recently, our Joint General Secretary of the NEU, Kevin Courtney, has said that the government is allowing many disadvantaged children and young people to fall through the gaps. All families who are entitled to free school meal support need access to a system of cash or vouchers to ensure they can access food for their child. And all eligible children must be able to access food and nutrition during the school holidays. The public have made their support for ensuring children receive free school meals in the holidays and during the pandemic really clear, with more than 1 million people signing Marcus Rashford's petition last year, calling on the government to expand eligibility and access to free school meals. But the government's neglect of children and young people most in need has been shocking during this pandemic. The DfE just must get better at planning ahead and making arrangements that work well for schools and families. We need the DfE to act now, before the end of term, to clarify arrangements for the summer holidays in terms of access to free school meals. Now, in some areas, I am aware free school meals vouchers have been announced, but not in all. And I think this is actually just a sticking plaster over a gaping wound. Because children are not actually poor. They live in a household that is poor. Their household is in poverty, not the child. It is not a child's fault that they are in poverty, and in vast majority of cases, it is not the parents' fault either. It is the society in which we live. We need to put pressure on the government to tackle poverty in general. And our campaigns have highlighted the issue of poverty and holiday hunger. However, we shouldn't be relying on trade unions, charities and Premier League footballers to feed our children. The system's broken and we need to campaign for it to be fixed. NEU conference over Easter this year voted to continue our campaigns around child poverty. We've voted to continue working with Child Poverty Action Group, and we are campaigning for an expansion of the free school meal system to include every child from a household in receipt of universal credit or equivalent benefits. We're campaigning for the eradication of holiday hunger by extending free school meal provision of at least £15 per child per week during all school holidays. We're campaigning for the reform of all school uniform policies to ensure uniform options are affordable for families in the local community. Campaigning for the provision of free household internet access for children and young people in households on universal credit. And campaigning for the establishment of new dedicated technology budgets for all schools to combat the digital divide. We want a reversal of the huge funding cuts schools and colleges have experienced over the past few years so as to support children and their families. And we want to continue to campaign to expose the government's failure to address issues of child poverty and inequality. It's hard to put food on the table when you live in poverty, and no one should go hungry. Thank you.
I'd like to say that was great, Merike. Thank you. And Sarah, I'd like to introduce you now. Sarah, you're a parent campaigner. You set up your own food campaign last summer. Please, could you tell us about what motivated you and how you went about it?
Yeah, of course. So I'm afraid that my speech, I'm not a public speaker. I'm just a regular parent, so I might not be as good as the other guys that have come before me, so you'll have to bear with me. So my name's Sarah, as Anya just said. I'm a recruitment consultant and a mum from Darlington, and I was asked to give a little speech about holiday hunger and the fundraising campaign that I orchestrated last year. I guess I should start with my sort of views on education, the educational system. I never really understood the logic for underfunding our schools or our educational institutions, and I've always really struggled with the rigidity of the national curriculum. I guess when I was in school, what I remember were the teachers who were a little bit crazy, a little bit off the wall, the ones that didn't necessarily stick to pre-formulated lesson plans and concentrate on tick box exercises, and those are the ones that sort of inspired me the most. I've struggled, as the lady that's just spoke before me said, with the insistence that we test our children more, and that somehow the need to be put under pressure in order to be successful. That's always seemed very alien to me, and I've never really got that. But last year, when Boris Johnson announced that he wasn't going to fund free school meals through the October half-term holidays, despite Marcus Rashford's amazing campaign, I was disappointed, to say the least. I genuinely did think that he would change his mind and feed our children, but it seems I was wrong. After the announcement, I spoke to my sister, who was a dinner lady at the time in a school, and she was telling me about a child who lives in poverty, and in this child's packed lunchbox that day, all she'd had was bread and butter, no filling for a sandwich, along with a yogurt and a biscuit. And it kind of got me thinking, you know, if those parents, knowing that that lunch is going to be seen by other people, and yet that's all they can manage to give, what are these children eating outside of school when there's no one around to monitor that? Not that I think that that's a parent's fault, but it made me think, you know, what's going on here? What do those parents and children eat during the holidays? And who's helping them with that? That's clearly a massive issue. So I knew that I had to do something. I knew that I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So I set up a fundraising campaign online. I'd seen an outpouring on social media about how this wasn't okay. There was absolute shock that in the middle of a pandemic in 2021, our government were allowing children to go hungry. So we set up the campaign, and I didn't really expect to get much, if I'm honest. I thought, you know, maybe £100, maybe we can do a few food parcels, give them to a couple of local families. Maybe that would, you know, be the sticking plaster that we've just talked about, but maybe that would help. So the next morning I woke up and there was over £900 donated on the online campaign, and to be honest, I had £900 at that point and no plan. I didn't know what I was going to do with all of that money. I didn't know how we were going to help people, and most of all, I didn't know how to get it to the people who needed it most. I had previously worked with a local charity, First Stop, who I got back in contact with. I spoke to the CEO there, and between us we contacted the bread and butter thing, which seemed quite apt considering the story that my sister had told me about the child who only had bread and butter in her packed lunchbox. So we used the bread and butter thing, who were an organisation that already run across Darlington. They provide food parcels, I guess, bags of food for £7.50, but the contents of the food is worth £30. So that's already set up in multiple hubs across Darlington, and we contacted them and we worked with them. And the following day we had 30 volunteers who put together 300 food parcels that were distributed across Darlington. The cost was met by our fundraising page, and also the local mayor and the council donated as well. I'm a mum of 3 children myself. I've seen the impact of the pandemic on families across my local area. In the past, I'd volunteered for homeless charities, and I'd regularly donated to food banks. But I guess, despite the fact that I would consider myself as quite intelligent, I'd never really thought about holiday hunger until that point. I think that it's one of those topics that's kind of ignorance is bliss, and I've definitely been ignorant for a long time. I've since checked the numbers in Darlington, and it is estimated that 25% of children are receiving free school meals. In 2019 to 2020, it was estimated that 4.3 million children, as we've already heard, were living in poverty, which equates to almost a third of each school class. Since these figures were released, COVID has decimated the economy, leaving many out of work, and the impact upon the children cannot yet be fully understood. But what I do know is that we need to fight harder, and our children deserve better. That's it from me.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for what you've done. So I'd like to open up to the room for any questions now then, please. Ian?
Thank you, Anya, and thank you for all the three people that have spoken. It's been most impressive. Redcar and Cleveland Council featured on Luke's list. I think we were near the top, so we know a little bit about child poverty. In Redcar and Cleveland, where I live in South Bank, we have what we call an eco shop, and people can buy 10 items for £2, and the items are all donated by various people and supermarkets. It's an absolute disgrace in the 21st century, the 5th richest country in the world, that we have to hear what we've just heard from the people that are working in these sorts of areas. And I'm sorry, looking to the government to do anything isn't going to work. I mean, I think we're on a relatively slow slide towards fascism in this country. And I think the evidence supports my belief. I mean, nobody mentioned universal credit, I don't think, in the presentations, because that's the uplift of £20 a week is going to be scrapped at the end of September. And that's going to plunge even more people into poverty. And the announcement next Monday, when we're all going to be celebrating so-called Freedom Day, which has been described as reckless by the World Health Organization, is going to put more poor people in even desperate straits because they're going to die in larger numbers. And I think that's what this cynical government is about. And I think they're being urged on by the supporters and the billionaires that run the press in this country. So there's no hope for poor people, I think, from this government. And, you know, I just very briefly like to run down some of the motions that are underway by this government. We all know they're about voter suppression, aren't they? They want people to prove who they are before they can vote in the bill that's coming forward. They're opposing judicial review. They think the Supreme Court should be scrapped. They constantly go on about so-called lefty lawyers who defend people that have got justifiable complaints. And the new policing bill will prevent people protesting if they're going to be noisy. And under the proposed statute, you will actually get a longer sentence for destroying a statue than committing rape. Those are the sort of priorities that this government are about. And Luke, you talked about being a charity. You must be aware that the so-called culture minister in the government is threatening charities if they don't toe the government line, particularly about our history in terms of slavery, for instance. You're going to be deprived of funding anyway. That's the agenda they've got. I think what we're facing is a full onslaught on ordinary working class people, and the beggar takes the hindmost. What I want to know is what my party, the Labour Party, is doing about this, because we're the only credible opposition in the country, and I don't hear any of the passion coming through in the way I've heard from people this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Luke, did you want to come back on some of the things that Ian's mentioned there?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, a number of things, just kind of thoughts. I mean, obviously, as a charity, we are concerned. I mean, as many businesses are, many people are, in terms of, you know, what the future holds and what the future holds for charities. We know that there is a decline in charities currently, and that's a real concern. And in terms of the work, I think the one thing I just particularly want to pick up on, Ian, is, you know, you talked about kind of, you know, you don't see the government doing anything about, you know, about this issue of poverty. I'm not going to comment on that directly, but I guess there's something about the hope, and I think that there's something. It kind of always comes back to the question, well, what can we do? And certainly, you know, as a charity, we're kind of thinking exactly the same question: what can we do? You know, we will keep campaigning on the issues that we need to be campaigning on, and you know, issues such as the universal credit, the uplift being scrapped, as you mentioned, Ian. But there's something about how we can support you know, certainly, you know, the work that we're doing at Children North East is about supporting schools to create this new way of being, this new kind of society. There's a fantastic quote from Gorard back about 10 years ago, who talks about, you know, can we within our schools create an environment that is that's not reflective of the society we see with those great inequalities, but one where no matter your household income, you get the same, that equity of opportunity, experience and learning and things like that. And I think for me, there's something about actually, yes, there is some things that we can do. No, it's not what we want to be doing. And we want to be, you know, dealing with some of those big kind of, you know, societal issues, but there's not, there is some hope. I think that's how I kind of, you know, I said earlier, I'm an idealist, but I do think there is hope. I think the steps that we can make within schools, if we talk about schools within our organizations, to eliminate some of those inequalities that people face, create a new norm, if you like. So I guess that's my response, Anya, at this stage, unless there's any kind of questions off the back of it.
Well, can I just ask then, how, sorry, I can see that other people want to come in, but how exactly are you working with schools? But also, and this goes to Merike as well, about colleges. I mean, I work in a college, but we have children, young people up to the age of 19 who are living in poverty. So they're not in school, they're in college, but they're still children, they're still living in poverty, and it affects their attainment, their well-being, their future life chances. How would you work with them, please?
Well, if I can, I'll pick up first, if that's okay, Merike, just to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do and how we tackle some of those inequalities that we see. We developed a program called Poverty Proofing, which you may or may not have heard of. This is a program where we go into schools and we speak to every single child in school. The reason we do this is because what we've identified through consultation with children and young people from deprived communities is that, I mean, 10 years ago, we did a wider consultation, and children living in poverty said the one place it can be miserable to be poor is school and the school day. And when we unpicked that further, actually what we found was children were finding certain kind of aspects of the school day a real challenge. So children able to identify who's eligible for free school meals because you go on the school trip and you get the brown or white paper bag, because children talking about not having the resources at home to be able to take part in homework. You know, children not being able to afford school trips, but it not just being the cost, it being the fact that all their friends have spending money, or might get the queue jumper pass at the theme park. There's a wide range of these things that children talked very openly about, kind of barriers that they were facing as a result of the school day. So we developed a program called Poverty Proofing the School Day, just to kind of, you know, which just very briefly, we go into schools, we speak to every single child in the school, and identify what the barriers are or challenges are for those children living in poverty, and work with the school to overcome some of those challenges. And that's what I mean by creating that new environment, an environment that's informed by the experiences of children, that can combat some of those inequalities that children face. And this isn't at all because schools were purposefully doing anything wrong. It was just having the opportunity for that lens. So that's the work that we've been developing around poverty proofing the school day, and actually we've worked with NEU and Child Poverty Action Group to develop a resource called Turn the Page on Poverty, which shares some of the kind of findings around that, and I'd really encourage you to have a look at that resource. So yeah, I didn't add the college bit, Anya. The college bit is that we have started working with colleges around that particular program, but a lot of the messages, you know, translate.
Okay, thank you. If you could share that link with us, that would be great, and then we can share that with our members too. And Merike, did you want to come back on that before I go to John?
Yeah, just quickly, a couple of things to add. One of the issues when you mentioned post-16 education there for funding as well, just like to link it to EHCP funding, so educational healthcare plans. There is a huge problem in this country with regards to that, because the funding doesn't automatically go with that young person once they hit the age of 18. And so we've got a whole group of young people in college who just can't afford, they don't have that money there to support them, and so that is also exacerbating the poverty situation that we're in. In the northern region of the NEU, we are planning on relaunching our child poverty campaign. We've got some meetings coming up over the next few weeks, and looking to relaunch again properly in September. And as part of that, I think we really do need to speak to our members in post-16 education, in schools, in colleges, and crucially, I think we need to speak to the students themselves and find out what it is that they want, so that they feel comfortable being able to access it. I think if we look at it down the line, similar to how period poverty campaigning has gone, that's now really taken off and has free sanitary products available in schools and colleges, which is helping to combat these issues. And it's done in such a way that the young people needing to use such products don't feel ashamed or embarrassed about doing so. And I think that's key in involving our young people, is getting rid of the stigma that's attached to it. But I think one of the only ways we can do that is by actually speaking to them and finding out what they would be comfortable with.
Well, I'd be quite happy to work with you on that. Can I go to John, please? John, for your question. John Harrison.
I don't think it's much a question as a commentary, really. I want to end up by saying how much volunteer effort and committed professionalism is to be applauded. I was in education up until 2010. I was a head for 20 odd years and a class teacher. And we tried to sort of bring in different changes, such as the period poverty campaign. We run free summer schools, for example, and we sponsored different people through uniforms and the like. But I remember reading in, I think it was about 1988, by a woman called Rosemary Dean, that schools are the most conservative of all institutions, and they hold back any form of societal change. Now, listening to what I've heard today, that doesn't any longer seem the case. And if we can have schools that lead in societal change, we'll all be a little bit better for it. And my second little comment is in relation to universal credit. For the past 4 days, I've been working on the cancel the cuts agenda at places like metro centres and shopping centres. And we've got I don't know what you call it, it's too army, I suppose, of concerns coming through as a result of that. In 1 hour at Benton Metro, I met 4 adolescents who were deeply distressed about the situation they're in. 2 of them as a result of overpayment by government and trying to get that money back. We've got people out there, we've got enthusiasts, we've got people trying. I do believe it's an all-out war that we're just about to face, and I wish you all luck. And I doff my cap to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that contribution. I would like to go to you, Luke, to see if you've got any concluding comments.
I think John gave some great concluding comments there. I mean, we are in a difficult situation. We are facing increasing levels of poverty, increasing challenges within schools and outside of schools. I think that there's I guess I hold on to the mantra that it's important that there's an awareness out there of the impacts of poverty. It's important that we respond to it, but I hold on to the fact that there is something we can do. And I think if we kind of approach the organisations within which we work, the organisations that we work with, and that we belong to, and really start to consider how can we, within our organisational setup, address and combat and eliminate kind of the challenges for those living in poverty, we can start to create something different, something new. And I agree, John, schools can really can take a leading role within that.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to say anything?
No, not really. But I'm available if you want to chat afterwards and we can get anything else up and running, then I'm available to help always.
Brilliant.
That's great.
Brilliant.
And then to Merike then, please. Concluding comments from you.
Concluding comment from me is, I'm going to pop a link in the chat. So that's a link to a video from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And if that can be shared far and wide to people who may not understand the devastating impact that poverty has, please share that. We need as many people on board to be able to find out why poverty is such a problem in our society, why it is an issue in our schools, why the attainment gap is rising. And that just shows that anybody off the street can be facing these issues. We need to mobilise as many people as possible in order to get change to happen, really, is my concluding comment on that.